evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 14 of The Name of the Rose. And tonight we resume our discussion of the awkwardly intimate scene in the middle of the monastery, in the middle of our book, in what is actually fairly close to, it's not at the center of the book, but it's not far. I've been thinking we were still stuck in day 2, but this is actually day 3 that we're talking about, that we're about to finish here today. I believe. Anyhow, so we're getting close to the middle of the week. Day 3. Yeah, day 3, month 5. Hey, that ratio is pretty good for me, actually. I think I'm kind of proud of that, actually. Anyhow, so we will come back to Adso here in a moment. Just a quick announcement to begin. So we have Sunshine Moot is our next moot that is coming up. Join us on the 22nd of February here this month, in just a couple weeks, down in Orlando, Florida, for Sunshine Moot. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to be spending the entire day planning the Muppet Lord of the Rings adaptation. It's going to be really cool. So lots of fun down in Orlando at Sunshine Moot this year. And then after that, up next will be SoCal Moot on the 15th of March. So looking forward to getting back to both of those places. Arthur the Count could do the ring poem. We'll have to see. Decisions are going to be made. We'll have to see what the writer's room comes up with there. But yes, so Sunshine Moot coming up very soon. SoCal Moot coming up not long after that. And up next after that are Tex Moot in the beginning of April, and then Willow Moot out in Belgium near the end of April. Lots of fun meetings and moots coming up, and keep your eye out for more news about Myth Moot. Myth Moot should be releasing very soon. We should be able to, it's, I haven't been given the exact date yet as to when early bird tickets will go on sale for Myth Moot, but that will be happening soon. Anyway, so those are things that are coming up. I wanted to let you know that if you go to the Signum Collaboratory or the store, you will find one thing that was just posted there recently that I was told about that I thought some of you might be interested in. Sarah Brown and James Tauber and I have been collaborating on a series of space modules on the collected poems of Tolkien, the new volumes that were published. And volume 1, which was the first 3 months, the first 3 space modules that we did on the poetry collection. All of our lectures from that series have been collected and are available for sale. 15 lectures in the Signum store and the Signum Collaboratory. So it still blows my mind that we have done, we have 15 lectures, 3 months worth of teaching and discussion on the poems that Tolkien wrote before 1919. That's like a year ago. We had how many poems in that time period? 5, maybe. It's so cool. It's so cool. So anyway, that's been a really, really fun project. So I encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to attend the our space modules, you can still kind of follow along with it. And you can purchase those lectures for download in our store. Or if you don't want to do that, instead, you can subscribe to the Collaboratory. And for a low monthly subscription, like our basic subscription is only $9 a month. And for the $9 a month, you can get access to everything in the Signum catalog. All of our lecture courses, all of our the space lectures, my book, other people's books, Mike Drout's whole enormous, amazing lecture series on Beowulf from beginning to end, video projects, so much. stuff. So anyway, you can get access to all of that stuff in the collaboratory for the subscription of $9 a month. Or again, you can buy the lectures just to download them and keep them separately on the store. Anyway, so just wanted to let folks know that that is available. That's been a really fun project. I've been enjoying. In my most recent lecture, I talked about two of Tolkien's poems. One was a satirical set of limericks that he wrote in the army, military satire limericks called Tu Lut, and also a multi-stanza poem that he wrote in rhyme royal on the occasion of Easter morning, contemplating the theology of Easter morning. So cool. That really fun combination of Tu Lut and the rhyme royal on Easter morning. I did both the ridiculous and the sublime in that one lecture, and it was really fun. Anyway, so that's just some of the stuff that's there in our space lectures there. All right, well, let us get back in the text, because goodness knows, though it could have been worse as far as the place where we left poor Adso, goodness knows, I'm sure it's been frustrating enough. So let us get back to Adso's ecstatic experience. Now remember, several things to keep in mind as context that we're bringing, because we're jumping straight into the naughty bits here tonight. We got all the build up to the naughty bits last time, but we didn't quite get there, right? So we're starting off right there here tonight. But remember, several pieces of context to keep in mind. The main one that I want us to keep in mind is the fact that the dilemma that Adso has been in. He has been hearing all this stuff, seeing all this stuff, both at the monastery and before. Remember his memories of the Dulcinian heretic monk who was burned at the stake in Florence, that he saw, like whose execution he witnessed right before he met Brother William and ended up here at the monastery with him. And so he has seen heretics and heretics and Orthodox, and he can't tell the difference. He's not sure what the rationale is. Why should you not only adhere to one and reject the other, but hate the one, slay the one, torture the one, and cleave to the other. But of course, the more he's learned and the more he's listened, as especially in that first conversation with Ubertino, where Ubertino was talking about, on the one hand, praising the ecstatic visions of people like Saint Clare, who was his friend. Remember, not Saint Francis's friend Saint Clare, but another Saint Clare. Anyway, she had these ecstatic visions, and then these heretics, her followers, claimed ecstatic visions, and they were condemned soundly by Ubertino. In fact, they were tortured and killed by Ubertino. And this started his whole problem of how can you discern? How can you tell the difference? And we've seen him listening to William's conversation with Ubertino, with the abbot. We've seen him himself, Adso himself, trying to get William to explain wherein the difference lies. And William's explanation was not helpful, because it seemed that William was conceding that there wasn't any significant difference. So we saw him then go back to Ubertino, hear the story of Fra Dolcino, and this has led up to this moment. And we had just been confronting some rather uncomfortable things, where sexual ecstasy, spiritual rapture, direct spiritual encounter with God, and death itself, in particular, the death of that heretical monk Dulcinian monk Michael that Adso witnessed. All three of those things, the death by burning, the sexual desire and sexual ecstasy, and spiritual fervor, contemplation, and ecstatic experience, all being sort of connected, right? Connected in to each other as if they are very, very similar experiences indeed. And that was a little uncomfortable. I think is a little uncomfortable for everyone. Was a little uncomfortable at the time, right? Then he goes, Adso, of course, goes into the library himself, and then he goes into the kitchen and finds this girl. Let us rejoin Adso at this memorable moment. What did I feel? What did I see? I remember only that the emotions of the first moment were bereft of any expression, because my tongue and my mind had not been instructed in how to name sensations of that sort. That sentence is extremely important. Adso has no words. He's having lots of feelings at this moment, right? Remember, the girl has been touching his face, and she is whispering words of praise and affection for him. And he doesn't have any words. Yes, the things that he's trying to point to, even in his own mind, he doesn't have signs for them. He doesn't have any language. He is having the experience of encountering things without words available, because this experience is completely outside his experience, right? He doesn't have language to attach to it. Until I recalled other inner words, heard in another time and in other places, spoken certainly for other ends, but which seemed wondrously in keeping with my joy in that moment, as if they had been born for the very purpose of expressing it. Okay, so that first reaction, no words, right? And then all of a sudden it clicks. He realizes, wait, I do have words for this. There are other words. And yes, they didn't come to him at first. Why didn't they come to him at first? Because they had been explicitly attached to other things, spoken for other ends. But now he feels them wondrously in keeping with his joy in that moment. They feel now the perfect expression, as if they had been born. The words had been born for the very purpose of expressing what he is going through. Words pressed into the caverns of my memory rose to the dumb surface of my lips, and I forgot that they had served in Scripture or in the pages of the saints to express quite different, more radiant realities. The words are scriptural words. They're holy words. And those words were designed to be signs pointing to something quite else. Quite different, more radiant realities. In fact, they are words designed to describe that spiritual experience, that ecstatic spiritual experience. But when he is searching for words to describe this experience that he's having right now, this experience of sexual desire and sexual pleasure, he all of a sudden says, wow, those words, in other words, Adso is now experiencing empirically what we've been talking about, right? The phenomenon that we've been seeing, the phenomenon that has been confusing him, right? That you use the same signs. The same signs are often used. Very similar words used to describe all three of those things. The sexual encounter, the divine encounter, and even the encounter with death. But now, again, he is sort of naively, in a sense, like without apparent self-consciousness of that fact. He's not connecting it back to his dilemma. He's not being like, it's just like Claire, exactly like Ubertina was saying. Like, he's not thinking about that at all, right? all he's doing is spontaneously having the experience that his dilemma had been about, right? But was there truly a difference between the delights of which the saints had spoken, those spiritual things, and those that my agitated spirit was feeling at that moment? At that moment, the watchful sense of difference was annihilated in me. Remember, that's been his whole thing. The watchful sense of difference. He's been going around being like, explain, what's the difference? I need to know. Spell it out for me, William. And William's like, I got nothing. I don't think there is that much difference, right? And he's like, there's got to be something. He goes back to Ubertino, like, surely Ubertino knows. He wasn't letting on before, but he's got to have the answer to this question, right? But that whole watchful sense of difference was annihilated in him. And this, it seems to me, is precisely the sign of rapture in the abysses of identity. The abysses of identity. And I think that's his way of characterizing what is the thing that all three of those experiences have in common. Martyrdom, or, I mean, again, whether Michael, the heretical monk, is considered a martyr or not is, like, depends on your perspective, right? Whether you agree with him or not. But the ecstatic death, his attitude towards his reception of his death, was certainly similar to that of the martyrs. Whether, in the end, you believe him actually to be a martyr or whether you believe him to be deluded, nevertheless, like, that similarity is clear. So let me just go with martyrdom for a minute. Martyrdom, sexual ecstasy, and encounter with the divine. What I think Echo is suggesting, what is it that ties all those things together? They are all an experience of rapture in the abyss of identity. When you are not just you, when you are outside yourself in some way, when there is some kind of joining of yourself to something else, someone else, when that experience that you have transcends just your normal sense of your own self and your own limitations. So, Adso, give us your words. Suddenly the girl appeared to me as the black but comely virgin of whom the Song of Songs speaks. She wore a threadbare little dress of rough cloth that opened in a fairly immodest fashion over her bosom, and around her neck was a necklace made of little colored stones, very commonplace, I believe. But her head rose proudly on a neck as white as an ivory tower. Her eyes were clear as the pools of Heshbon. Her nose was as the tower of Lebanon, and her hair like purple. Yes, her tresses seemed to me like a flock of goats, her teeth like flocks of sheep coming up from their bath, all in pairs, so that none preceded its companion. And I could not help murmuring, Behold, thou art fair, my love. Behold, thou art fair. Thy hair is as a flock of goats that lie along the side of Mount Gilead. Thy lips are like a thread of scarlet. Thy temples are like a piece of a pomegranate. Thy neck is like the Tower of David, whereupon was hung 1,000 bucklers. And I asked myself, frightened and rapt, who was she who rose before me like the dawn, beautiful as the moon, radiant as the sun, terribilis ut castorum acies ordinata. What a sweet talker that Adso, right? I mean, come on. Okay. Yeah. I assigned the homework, of course, to read the Song of Solomon, so to make sure that you would get these references, right? That you would hear what's going on, right? So, Gerald, I think that Adso actually says the bits in quotation marks. I think he's actually saying, behold, thou art fair, my love, behold, thou art fair, and all that other stuff. But I bet he's saying it in Latin and the girl doesn't understand. So I'm sure it sounds very, very passionate and, very, I'm sure it came off better for not actually being translated. But, yeah, so, all right. So I'm not going to do a whole analysis of, this language in the Song of Songs. The important thing is, remember, these are the words. These are the words that he was just referring to. Remember? Let's go back to that. Until I recalled other inner words, heard in another time and in other places, spoken certainly for other ends, but which seemed wondrously in keeping with my joy in that moment, as if they had been born for the very purpose of expressing it. And yes, Fencing Frog, we know it wasn't German, or she'd have run screaming, right? She's scared of German, which is Adso's, of course, his native language. Yeah. Anyway, so these are the words. These are his words. Now, what does this have in common with the finding of Brunellus the horse? Specifically with the description of Brunellus the horse. Even the name of Brunellus the horse. Back at the beginning of day 1. Remember that? That was partially a setup for this moment. This is kind of a fulfillment. In my opinion, this is a huge comic payoff for that. We've seen several allusions to this pattern of thinking, right? And Adso's busting out with the Song of Songs as a totally spontaneous expression of his erotic experience. This is hilarious. I was like, when I reread this again, before this study, I last read this book in college. It's been, decades now since I read it. So, which means it's practically like reading it again for the first time, which I still assert is the absolute coolest thing about getting old. Anyone who's worried about getting old, keep this in mind. When you get old, you get to reread books for the first time. Like, people don't talk about this enough. This is a big deal. Anyway, yeah. It's true. It's kind of true. You can kind of meet people again for the first time, but that's usually a little more awkward. But anyway, the point is, when I reread this for the first time, this time round, I was cracking up. My wife was like, "What are you reading?" And I'm like, "The Name of the Rose." She's like, "I don't remember it being that funny." I'm like, "Me neither, but this passage is hilarious." This is great. This is great stuff here. Now, again, Brunellus the horse. You remember how that worked? How was it that William was able to quote exactly what the monk and the abbot and the cellarer, how they would both describe the horse? How did he know exactly the adjectives to use? How did he guess that its name was Brunellus? Because it's in the books. In that case, he was quoting, who was it? Isidore of Seville, right? Isidore's etymologies. And the point that he was making is, these monks, they live their lives through books. Their lives are restricted to the monastery. Most of them don't leave it. Their entire world is the narrow confines of this monastery and the much wider confines of all the books that they read. Those are always going to be, William says, the signs that monks use, such that the point that he goes on to make, is that it actually affects their perception of reality. If Isidore of Seville says this is what a good horse looks like. And the abbot believes that his horse is a good horse. He is going to convince himself that it has the characteristics that that Isidore has described of a good horse, because his horse is a good horse. This is what Isidore says a good horse looks like. Ergo, that's what his horse must look like, because it's a good horse, and that's what Isidore says, right? And it may seem really weird that you would be like, well, shouldn't you actually just describe based on what the horse in fact looks like? And the answer is no, you don't, in fact, because that idea of a good horse is more important, is more influential even, so anyway, so what Adso does here is exactly the same thing. Remember that moment in which he had no words. He is having an experience unlike any experience in his life. He's having lots of feelings, right, of lots of different kinds, and he doesn't know any words to attach to them. It makes me think of the remarks that C.S. Lewis makes at Eustace's expense in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, right? That he'd read none of the right kind of books. And so he doesn't know how to, this is why he falls to the dragon thing, because he had read the wrong books and didn't know anything about dragons. If he had, he might have been more wary, or at least less surprised. Adso is a more extreme example of that situation, right? He has read none of the right kinds of books. Well, that's not actually true. Come to think of it, he has read some of the right books, because he just rattled off a passage of Gottfried's Tristan und Isolde, the German one, presumably. Or was it? The Business with the Lepers, where King Mark, after he finds Isolde's adultery with Tristan, is going to send her out to be gang raped by a leper colony. It's a horrifying incident. That's the one. Remember? Adso recalled that. And now I'm trying to remember, is that in Gottfried's Tristan or is that in Thomas's French one? Shoot. I think I immediately assumed German because I know that Adso's German. But something in my... Oh, gosh. I don't remember. But in any case, it doesn't matter. Point is, he's read enough romances, right? He's read enough pulp fiction to have some vocabulary. I mean, if he's read Tristan and Isolde, he's got some vocabulary for this, actually. Yeah, Jocelyn, that incident with the leper colony, that is like the nadir of King Mark's jerkitude in all of every version of the Tristan. It never gets worse than that. Then when he's like, yeah, let's send Isolde out to the leper colony. That's the worst. He never gets worse than that in any edition of it. I want to say that's the French version. I'm gonna have to go look it up, but I can't do that right now. Anyway, there was like one major French and one major German one. The German one is better. Gottfried's is awesome. But Fencing Frog, yes, you're right. Although, given what he has just betrayed about his reading, remember William comments on it, he's like, so someone has been reading interesting things, right? That, novices really are not supposed to be reading. Not exactly on the required syllabus for Benedictine novices, Tristan and Isolde. Anyway, Adso doesn't go there. Even though that's actually, sorry. I had forgotten about that until this moment. But for whatever reason that he does not recall, he's not put in mind of Tristan and Isolde. He does not cast himself as Tristan and her is Isolde, he is not saying, "Ho gaff me drink," as, sorry, that's a quote of Crusade, in Troilus and Crusade, Chaucer's Troilus and Crusade. She quotes Isolde in that moment, the love potion. Never mind, don't worry about it. The point is, there's this whole courtly love tradition that he could be quoting at this moment, but he doesn't quote it. He's a total blank until the Song of Solomon comes to his rescue. And notice the progression that happens. It isn't just that. When he talks about it on the previous slide, when he talks about it, he recognizes that he's repurposing. He knows that these words were said in another place for another purpose, that they were designed to express quite different, more radiant realities. This is not just talking about sex. Now, of course, on the literal level, it does in fact seem to be talking about sex, right? It's not like he's quoting, the Magnificat or something like that, right? He is in fact quoting erotic love poetry from the Old Testament, right? So, it is in fact, on one level, perfectly apropos of his situation. But he speaks of it being written for more radiant purposes. And you remember, we talked about this last time. That was the purpose. The allegorical reading of the Song of Songs was taken to be that's the primary meaning of that. Even to read it as love poetry, and think about the two human interlocutors who are going back and forth throughout that rather steamy poetic encounter in the Song of Solomon, to focus on them and their affection, their desire for each other, would be not just to miss the point, but to, in a sense, and I know this sounds weird to say, in a sense, it would be to import a false meaning into the text, because that's not what the text is about. It's just a vehicle. It's a vehicle for those higher things. And to focus on just the vehicle is to miss the point. To miss the point almost completely. So yes, Eric, he has had scripture drilled into his mind, and it is the most ready-to-hand language that he has, just like the Isidore of Seville language about the horse, right? But again, notice the phrasing. Suddenly the girl appeared to me as the black but comely virgin of whom the Song of Songs speaks. He sees her differently. Just as, remember that disconnect, potential disconnect at least, between what the abbot's horse actually looks like and how they would describe it, because they describe it quoting Isidore of Seville instead of actually just looking at the horse, right? That same kind of disjunction we see immediately here in Adso's own experience. He says, she appeared to me as the black but comely virgin of whom the Song of Songs speaks. And then he immediately goes and describes what she actually looks like, which is not at all like what the black but comely virgin in the Song of Songs is described as looking like. And yet, he segues to it. But her head rose proudly on a neck as white as an ivory tower, and that simile kicks it off, right? Neck as white as an ivory tower, now we're rolling. Her eyes were clear as the pools of Heshbon. Where is Heshbon? I don't know. Somewhere in Israel, right? This is Hebrew poetry, right? Her nose was as the Tower of Lebanon. That is not a helpful simile for Adso at all. Adso hasn't the faintest idea what the Tower of Lebanon looks like, right? Her tresses seemed to me like flocks of goats, her teeth like flocks of sheep. Adso needn't know a thing about sheep or goats at all. He is not, in fact, he's not using similes that way. He is experiencing reality through the language of the Bible. Why does he think of her nose like the Tower of... Why does her nose remind him of the Tower of Lebanon, which he has no idea what it looks like and he's never seen? Because he has been led to think about the Tower of Lebanon, because he will have read probably many people interpreting that allegorically. He will have heard. I think St. Augustine, I can't remember what St. Augustine says about the Tower of Lebanon. But he's definitely thinking about, he doesn't know what the Tower of Lebanon looks like, but he knows the interpretation of the Tower of Lebanon. He knows all about the teeth like flocks of sheep coming up from their bath. St. Augustine explains all about that. So he understands that language. Not pictures, understands. And so he feels on safe ground. And then he takes it to the next level. He starts saying it aloud. Behold, thou art fair, my love. Behold, thou art fair. He's quoting the whole way through. Oh, sorry. One of you was asking about the as terrible as an army with banners is the phrase, I think, that's in Latin there at the end. Footnote. This is why and I think I am not alone, did a weird double take in season 1 of The Rings of Power when King Durin III was recalling his joy at holding his young son, and young Durin IV, right? And describes, King Durin III, is reaching for language to describe how beautiful his son looked to him, the face of his son. And he quotes that line and calls the face of his baby son as terrible as an army with banners. And I was like, okay, hang on. Can we not cross? Can I uncross those wires and heal the short circuit in my brain that just happened when you did that? But because yes, like it's at least Adso's putting it into an erotic context. Though I will say, in defense of Durin III, the line kind of works better describing the face of a baby dwarf prince. As terrible as an army with banners sounds very, fearsome and impressive and imposing and militaristic. To say that the body of your beloved is as radiant as the sun and as terrible as an army with banners is much better poetry, but much less, it's a little less straightforward. And certainly another indication that the kind of poetry that is being employed here, the kind of imagery that is being brought in with all of these similes, it's not visual imagery. No, First Fish, it's not like that. It's the opposite of that. It's not prepared as a field for conquering. It is arrayed as an army that's about to conquer you. It's an expression of his own sense of vulnerability, I think. His sense that she is irresistible, not irresistible to be taken, like that she can't resist being taken, but that he can't resist being taken by her, that he is overwhelmed. It's how I understand the poetry in the Song of Songs is what I'm talking about there, and therefore it's sort of indirect relevance here. But anyway, yeah. So anyway, sorry. End sidebar about King Durin III. Terrible is a really fascinating word. terrible as an army. It inspires terror. Her body inspires terror. Yeah. Right. No, I see you didn't put any pronouns in there. It was your use of the past participle, prepared, because we were talking about the description of the woman, which made it sound like you were talking about the description of the woman. But anyway, and yes, Fencing Frog, it maps out very well onto the holy terror of encountering God as well. So yeah, no, there's, if ever, again, in my experience teaching this passage to college students in a secular environment, there was a lot of tendency to snigger at the medievals and their spiritual allegory that they were drawing from the Song of Songs, as if they were just prudes desperate to, deflect the sex talk. But I think that those who sniggered were missing the point entirely. The point which, by the way, even before this moment, Adso had not been missing. He is now experiencing the perfect fit, what he felt to be the perfect fit between sexual language and spiritual language, the sexual counter and the spiritual encounter. And Fencing Frog, I agree. There was a lot of chronological snobbery, always is. Okay. And she kissed me with the kisses of her mouth, and her loves were more delicious than wine, and her ointments had a goodly fragrance, and her neck was beautiful among pearls, and her cheeks among earrings. Behold, thou art fair, my beloved, behold, thou art fair. Thine eyes are as doves, I said, and let me see thy face, let me hear thy voice, for thy voice is harmonious, and thy face enchanting. Thou hast ravished my heart, my sister, thou hast ravished my heart with one of thine eyes, with one chain of thy neck. Thy lips drop as the honeycomb. Honey and milk are under thy tongue. The smell of thy breath is of apples. Thy two breasts are clusters of grapes. Thy palate a heady wine that grows straight to my love and flows over my lips and teeth. A fountain sealed, spikenard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, myrrh and aloes. I have eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I have drunk my wine with my milk. Who was she? Who was she who rose like the dawn, fair as the moon, clear as the sun, terrible as an army with banners? Who's even talking here? Young Adso? Old Adso? This is a close, he's sticking to the language. It's a hodgepodge of the Song of Songs here. And it is all language also used for the Virgin Mary. Correct. Yes, that's the spiritual encounter thing, right? Yeah, exactly. Yes. And the my sister thing, by the way, that's also my sister, my love. That is straight from the Song of Songs. Okay. So, all right. Notice. Who is she? What's he asking there? It's, if I could put the force of this really, really crudely, I would say is like, Adso's still aware that there's another person involved here, right? Like it's like, hello, Adso. Like, he seems to be so lost in the ecstasy of the words. First, he was having this overwhelming experience that he couldn't find words for. and then he found words, and the words have now taken over that experience. Now it's the words themselves that are guiding the experience. This girl is a local peasant. If not a prostitute, a girl who seems, in William's assessment, very likely to habitually trade sexual favors for gifts from probably what's his face, the ugly bestial. I'm forgetting. Why am I blanking on his name? Anyway, you know the guy I'm talking about. Salvatore. Thank you, Salvatore. There are downsides to getting old too, but reading books again for the first time makes it all worth it. Anyway, yeah. But anyway, the smell of thy breath is of apples. Really? You think? You think? Honey and milk are under thy tongue? Truly? Thy voice is harmonious and thy face enchanting? Maybe. Maybe. I love the reference. Again, this is in the text, the original text, Song of Songs, I mean. I love the reference to the chain. Sorry, where'd it go? You ravished my heart. Yes, thou hast ravished my heart with one of thine eyes, with one chain of thy neck. What, like the commonplace string of beads that she had around her neck that he was describing? Her lips drop as the honeycomb? Maybe. No. Stop trying to picture things visually, Gerald. No. Her breasts are as clusters of grapes. That's a good thing. In other places in the Song of Songs, of course, her breasts are like two young deer leaping on the hilltops. Don't picture it. You're not supposed to picture it. It's about it's about what you're thinking about it. You're not picturing it. But yes, Jackie, that's exactly the point. The words have transformed her. The words that he recalls, the words that he finds that fit perfectly this experience, transform the experience itself. Transform her. He's sitting there thinking, saying out loud, who even knows? At this point, who was she? Who was she who rose like the dawn? She's right there, Adso. Right? Who was she? Past tense? She's right there. She's right there. I mean, like, they're actually embracing in the moment that he's going on this way, right? And I know he still doesn't know who she is. And it's one of the things that doubtless makes these words feel more so perfectly fitted, right? But again, this whole expression, the sort of funny thing about quoting the Song of Songs in this situation, the Song of Songs isn't really a poem about sex. It's a poem about longing for sex, right? Like, it goes back and forth, and they're talking about how they're missing each other, and they're like, it's more like notes you would pass in class, or letters you would send, or something like that. It's about desire. It's not about consummation. That I have drunk my wine with my milk. Who was she? Who was she who rose like the dawn? That is poetry that is remembering a previous embrace and longing for another one, right? Like, again, within its original poetic context, that's what it's doing. And yet he's like, she's right there, Adso, right? This is not the moment, except it is the moment, right? Because he is embracing her. He is connecting with this girl intimately. And yet, what he's experiencing, the signs have completely hijacked the thing. First came the thing with no signs, the feelings with no words. Then the words came, and now the words are driving the bus, right? And that's really interesting. That's really funny. O Lord, when the soul is transported, the only virtue lies in loving what you see. Is that not true? The supreme happiness in having what you have. Their blissful life is drunk at its source. Has this not been said? There you savor the true life that we will live after this mortal life among the angels for all eternity. This is what I was thinking, and it seemed to me the prophecies were being fulfilled at last, as the girl lavished indescribable sweetness on me, and it was as if my whole body were an eye, before and behind, and I could suddenly see all surrounding things, and I understood that from it, from love, unity and tenderness are created together, are as good and as are good and kiss and fulfillment, as I had already heard, believing I was being told about something else. And only for an instant, as my joy was about to reach its zenith, did I remember that perhaps I was experiencing, and at night, the possession of the noontime devil, who was condemned finally to reveal himself in his true diabolical nature to the soul that in ecstasy asks, "Who are you?" who knows how to grip the soul and delude the body. But I was immediately convinced that my scruples were indeed devilish, for nothing could be more right and good and holy than what I was experiencing, the sweetness of which grew with every moment. Okay. He does think more, right, about what's going on, about this experience, as his joy is about to reach its zenith. As his soul is transported, as he says. Again, note the language. Remember our uncomfortable tripod, right? Sexual ecstasy, martyrdom, death, and encounter with the divine. In all three instances, the soul is transported. Right? When the soul is transported, the only virtue lies in loving what you see, the supreme happiness in having what you have. There blissful life is drunk at its source. There you savor the true life that we will live after this mortal life among the angels for all eternity. Think about that tripod. Think of all three of those situations. And the realization which Adso seems to have in this moment is that, remember, he was trying to discern the difference. What's the difference? There has to be a difference between, sexual promiscuity and holy contemplation of the divine. A difference between St. Clare and the followers of St. Clare, one of whom was revered by Ubertino, the other of whom was executed by Ubertino. There has to be a difference. And in this moment, as he experiences it, well, one version of it, he finds that there isn't any difference. I understood that from love, unity and tenderness are created together, are as are good and kiss and fulfillment. As I had already heard, believing I was being told about something else. Once again, he's remembering words that were being told to him about a different thing, for a different end. And he is importing those words into this moment as his joy is about to reach its zenith and his soul is being transported, and he finds them apt. He finds that the description of spiritual experience, which he has been reading about and hearing about for all of his young life, do in fact fit perfectly. He doesn't distinguish a difference between them. And he has that doubt. Am I being deceived? But I was immediately convinced that my scruples, it's his scruples that are devilish. Nothing could be more right and good and holy than what I was experiencing, the sweetness of which grew with every moment. What he is rejecting is the differentiation. So Adso's conclusion, Adso is nearing his conclusion here to the dilemma that he's been having, right? And his conclusion appears to be he was having trouble seeing the difference because the difference may not be there, it seems. Now that, with a hand that trembles, either in horror at the sin I am recounting or in guilty nostalgia of the event I recall, I write these lines, I realize that to describe my wicked ecstasy of that instant, I have used the same words that I used not many pages before to describe the fire that burned the martyred body of the Fraticello Michael. He brings in the third leg of the uncomfortable tripod, right? Death. Nor is it an accident that my hand, passive agent of the soul, has penned the same expression for two experiences so disparate, because probably I experienced them in the same way both at the time, when I lived through them, and now, as I have tried to bring them back to life on this parchment. There is a mysterious wisdom by which phenomena among themselves disparate can be called by analogous names, just as divine things can be designated by terrestrial terms, and through equivocal symbols, God can be called lion or leopard, and death can be called sword, joy, flame, death, abyss, perdition, raving, and raving passion. He notices, when he's thinking back to the Fraticelli Michael, he is noticing that he has used the same word. He's already talked about how he has whole-scale imported the words of spiritual ecstasy into his, not just his retroactive description, but his in-the-moment experience of sexual ecstasy. And now he recognizes, yeah, I used exactly the same words. The same signs pointed to the burning of the martyred body of the Fraticello Michael, that those same signs pointed to his sexual experience / spiritual experience as well. Then he talks about it. There is a mysterious wisdom by which phenomena among themselves disparate can be called by analogous names. Mysterious wisdom, I think, is important. I think when Adso uses the word mysterious, he is not just using it in the common way in which we tend to use that word. We will say it's mysterious if we mean we don't understand. He does mean he doesn't understand it, but it means more than that. The mysteries are the things that defy explanation, the things that cannot be explained. Because the only way you can explain something is in words. And words and our signs, they're all material things, right? We only understand things by metaphors and analogies. When we try to contemplate spiritual things, yes, as in a liturgical mystery, like the sacrament itself, that bread, is it bread or is it the body of Christ? It is both. Jesus, was he God or was he man? 100% of both. These are mysteries. Mysteries that can't just... it's the union of two things, the meeting of a frontier, and you're trying to explain it with things that are native to only one side of that frontier. And so you're not going to be able to explain it. You're not going to be able to point to it exactly. Calvin says, isn't it also something that's been revealed by God? Yeah, again, it's those places where the divine and the human overlap. Anyway, so there's a mysterious wisdom by which phenomena among themselves disparate can be called by analogous names. What is the trend of his thought in this second paragraph? He acknowledges, okay, he's just acknowledged this. I use the same words to describe my spiritual/sexual ecstasy as I did to describe the martyrdom of Michael. That seems weird. That seems uncomfortable. Those were two very disparate experiences. But there's a mysterious wisdom in it, in which names, signs, have multiple purposes. The Trinity seems a good mystery to reference given our uncomfortable tripod. That's true. The Trinity is a slightly uncomfortable tripod of its own. Yes. And also a mystery. Agreed. Look how he goes on to illustrate it. Through equivocal symbols, God can be called lion or leopard, and death can be called sword. Joy can be called flame. Flame can be called death. Divine things can be designated by terrestrial terms. What is called a leopard? I was thinking about that too, Calvin. It's got to be an allegorical interpretation. There aren't that many times when leopards are referred to. There are some, but not that many. So at least one of them has to be somewhere. Has to be taken to be an allegorical figuring of God. But I can't think of what text he's and of course it needn't be the Bible. It could very likely be one of the church fathers as well. The lion's easier, Calvin, I agree. So yes, you can call God lion, but that doesn't mean he's actually a real lion, right? By the way, this is part of the joke in Narnia, right? This is part of the joke in The Horse and His Boy, when Bree, the horse, who has grown up in, has lived most of his life in Calormen, has a purely theological understanding of Aslan's lionhood, right? And assumes that lion, as applied to Aslan, is a mere metaphor, right? It's exactly what the kind of thing that Lewis is playing with, the same sort of thing that Echo is here in that moment. Oh, Hosea 13:7, huh, JJ? Didn't remember that one. Leopard reference? I believe it. So I will be like a lion to them, like a leopard I will lie in wait by the wayside. There you are. Lion and leopard, one verse. There you go. Yep. Anyway, okay. So the conclusion one would draw, remembering that divine things can be designated by terrestrial names, remembering that there is a mysterious wisdom by which phenomena among themselves disparate can be called by analogous names, means that the similarity of the words, the fact that the same words can be applied to each of the three legs of our uncomfortable tripod, doesn't prove that they're in fact all the same thing, any more than that calling God a lion or a leopard proves that he is both a lion and a leopard simultaneously, right? Or either one, right? The final realization that he seems, in a sense here, I think, to kind of back off a little bit. In the moment, when he's describing the moment, that moment was full of this certainty of identity, that there is no real distinction. When the soul is transported, the soul is transported. And it is love, and it must be good. And now he seems to at least question that. Old Adso seems to question it some, recognizing just because the same words are used doesn't actually prove anything. What was similar in Michael's desire for death, in the transport I felt at the sight of the flame consuming him? Notice he's describing his feelings, not just Michael's feelings, though Michael's feelings are involved too, his desire for death. Sorry, I shouldn't interrupt Umberto Eco's extremely long sentences. What was similar in Michael's desire for death, in the transport I felt at the sight of the flame consuming him, in the desire for carnal union I felt with a girl, in the mystic shame with which I translated it allegorically, and in the desire for joyous annihilation that moved the saint to die in his own love in order to live longer and eternally? Is it possible that things so equivocal can be said in such a univocal way? He's now, old Adso, is now acknowledging, in fact, these things are not the same. Michael's desire for death, my transport while watching him die, my desire to have sex with his girl, the shame. He now attributes his translation of the experience into Song of Songs language as a way that he was covering his shame. And the desire for joyous annihilation that moved the saint to die. All of these, there are big differences among these things. Is it possible that things so equivocal can be said in such a univocal way? We can use the same words to describe these very, very different things. And this, it seems, is the teaching left us by St. Thomas, the greatest of all doctors. This is Aquinas he's talking about. The more openly it remains a figure of speech, the more it is a dissimilar similitude and not literal, the more a metaphor reveals its truth. But if love of the flame and of the abyss are the metaphor for the love of God, can they be the metaphor for love of death and love of sin? Yes, as the lion and the serpent stand both for Christ and the devil. The fact is that correct interpretation can be established only on the authority of the fathers, and in the case that torments me, I have no auctoritas to which my obedient mind can refer, and I burn in doubt. And again, the image of fire appears to define the void of the truth and the fullness of the error that annihilate me. What is happening, O Lord, in my spirit, now that I allow myself to be gripped by the vortex of memories, and I conflagrate different times at once, as if I were to manipulate the order of the stars and the sequence of their celestial movements? Certainly I am overstepping the boundaries of my sinful and sick intelligence. Now, let us return to the task I had humbly set myself. I was telling about that day and the total bewilderment of the senses into which I sank. There I have told what I remembered on that occasion, and let my feeble pen, faithful and truthful chronicler, stop there. Yes, Adso, I think you've done justice to the moment in its own little way. And yes, Jocelyn, absolutely. It is not only Adso who has thought about those three things, that is, sex, death, and spiritual encounter together. And that was indeed a favorite pun of in the Renaissance. It isn't true that every time Renaissance poetry refers to death, they're talking about orgasm, but it overlays a great deal of it. But anyway, yeah. All right. There's so much to unpack in this paragraph, and I don't want to spend the whole rest of our time just doing a line by line. Let me come back to what the Aquinas quote, however, because this is one of the ways in which he's understanding this. Again, remember, he begins this bit by marveling that things so different can be said in such a univocal, with one voice way, like with the same words, with the same signs. So he remembers his Aquinas. The more openly it remains a figure of speech, the more it is a dissimilar similitude and not literal, the more a metaphor reveals its truth. That is Aquinas. So this is Aquinas explaining. This, if I remember correctly, this is in the bit of Aquinas where he's talking about how to interpret Scripture. About allegorical interpretation and such. Aquinas is addressing the question, is it appropriate to speak of God in symbolic language? Like, why would it make sense for God to do that? Some of you may not know how the Summa Theologica was written, Thomas Aquinas' great opus. The Summa Theologica is phrased as a set of questions. So it asks a question. Is this thing true or whatever? And he considers like counter arguments. So it'll be something like, is it true that Jesus was fully God and fully man? And then he'll be like, it seems that it cannot be true that Jesus is fully God and fully man, because like that totally doesn't make sense. And then he'll give like three other reasons why, like it's like even quoting authorities and things as to why the thing really surely isn't true. And then he turns and says, but I say, and then he gives the response of like, no, this is actually why that is true. And then he goes back and he gives counter arguments to all of the individual. He gives, the replies to the objections. That's the entire, there is nothing else in the Summa Theologica but a series of impeccably organized and hierarchically constructed sets of questions in which to investigate everything in the world, in heaven and earth, and then to look at it carefully, each one carefully from both sides. It is the Summa Theologica. Who was it? C.S. Lewis, who said that the Summa Theologica and the Divine Comedy are the two most perfect expressions of medieval thought, for their elegance, their love for almost obsessive organization and patterns and everything. Anyway, so the Aquinas that he's quoting here is when Aquinas is examining the question, is it appropriate for spiritual truths to be designated symbolically by talking about, in the figure of carnal things? And of course, he begins off being like, it appears that it is not appropriate for this reason. And, because the similitudes are dissimilar, right? If you're comparing the God to like a leopard, then then it is not appropriate, to do that, because God is spiritual and a leopard isn't. And, you see what I mean? In his response to that objection, he says this: the more openly it remains a figure of speech, the more it is a dissimilar similitude and not literal, the more a metaphor reveals its truth. Basically, his answer to the objection is, hey, dumbo, that's what a metaphor does, right? The whole point of a metaphor is not that you are identifying, and he's not saying like, oh yeah, the truth is God is a leopard. Like, that's what we should have realized all along, right? That like he, likes to hang out in trees and enjoys a good tummy rub. Like, no, like he's like, that's not the point of the metaphor. It's to draw a similitude, but a similitude in dissimilitude, right? It's the fact that God is in fact not exactly a leopard that makes the metaphor useful, that makes it reveal its truth. If you're trying to make a metaphor, you try to make a metaphor in order to capture something, to try to describe something, to try to attach signs and words and ideas to the heart of a thing. But if your metaphor is too on the nose, if it's too close to the thing itself, it's not going to convey much. The more we're aware of it, right? The more you're aware of the metaphoricalness of the metaphor, the more effective the metaphor is in conveying its point. The author of the Song of Solomon might say, the fact that her teeth are in many ways quite unlike sheep brings home the point about the sheep, right? You compare them to sheep, not because they are in fact exactly like sheep, but because you're drawing out this one element, and the fact, all the differences that in fact even the poet himself could readily perceive between the teeth of his beloved and sheep, right? Those differences help to spotlight the truth that is being revealed, the similarity that's being drawn. Calvin, I'm only speculating that leopards enjoy tummy rubs. I have a feeling that they would. It's only just a hypothesis of mine, and I'm not fully prepared to test my hypothesis right now, but nevertheless, I maintain it as a hypothesis. Okay. Old Adso feels himself to have wandered into very deep waters indeed. He has faithfully represented not only what he experienced, but what it led him to think at the time. And now he fears that he is overstepping the boundaries of his sinful and sick intelligence. And he's just going to leave it aside. So I suppose, so should we. Let's keep going a little bit. Here's William's response to Adso, part of his response to Adso's story. He's talking about women here. Remember the Whore of Babylon, Virgin Mary thing that we were talking about before? Or to use consistently the two Revelations figures, the woman clad in the sun and the Whore of Babylon. Calvin, Adso said that he should stop. I didn't say we should stop. We're coming close to stopping, but but I don't have to obey him. William says, nevertheless, dear Adso, I cannot convince myself that God chose to introduce. So he's talking about women and saying how many teach that women are only the only point of women is to be corruptive influences and seductive temptations to men to draw them into sin, that they are like instruments of the devil exclusively. And goodness knows you can find plenty of writings, especially by men who never interacted with women in most of their lives, that's what women are like. But William has a different theory. Nevertheless, dear Adso, I cannot convince myself that God chose to introduce such a foul being into creation without also endowing it with some virtues. And I cannot help reflecting that he granted her many privileges and motives of prestige, 3 of them very great indeed. In fact, he created man in this base world and from mud. Woman he created later, in earthly paradise and of noble human matter. And he did not mold her from Adam's feet or his viscera, but from the rib. In the second place, the Lord, who is all-powerful, could have transformed himself into a man in some miraculous way, but he chose instead to become flesh in the womb of a woman, a sign that it was not so foul after all. And when he appeared after the resurrection, he appeared to a woman. And finally, in the celestial glory, no man shall be king of that realm, but the queen will be a woman who has never sinned. Virgin Mary, of course. Queen of Heaven, as she was often called in the Middle Ages. If, then, the Lord showed such favor to Eve herself and to her daughters, is it so abnormal that we also should feel drawn by the graces and the nobility of that sex? What I mean to say to you, Adso, is that you must not do it again, of course, but it is not so monstrous that you were tempted to do it. Yeah. Yeah, Mary says William is absolutely the person you'd want to confess this to. Yeah, I agree. If I were Adelmo, I would have sought out William, not Jorge. Right? Jorge is the guy you don't want to confess to. But William, yeah, I think probably. So he's just spent, this fat paragraph making the pro-woman arguments. All of these are made. Like these are not just, this is not just the voice of modernity, right? The voice of, modern sensibilities being put into William's mouth. All of these were in fact arguments. There were, in fact, people who spoke against the violent anti-feminism of many of the church writers. And these were, all of them, arguments that were often made about that when that was happening. They didn't get all that much traction, the pro-woman arguments. I love the ending of it. What I mean to say is that you must not do it again, of course, but it's not so monstrous that you were tempted to do it. He gives this, presents this all as a sort of justification. If the Lord showed such favor to Eve herself and to her daughters, is it so abnormal that we also should feel drawn by the graces and nobility of that sex? Yeah. Yes, it is not so monstrous that you were tempted to do it. It is... no, never mind. I'm not even going to go further down the feminist and anti-feminist track, or next thing you know, I'm going to be talking about the wife of Bath. Yeah. So no, I'm not going to go there because that's not the book we're reading right now. Canterbury Tales, I mean. Yes. Let's see. Peek ahead. No, let's stop there. I did want to get to at least glance at some of William's response. William does not. The last point I would want to make. William does not weigh in on the sort of larger questions, the larger experience that Adso has had, which seems only appropriate because, remember, Adso had a conversation already with William about this, and William's answers didn't satisfy him, right? So they don't really discuss it again. Next time, believe it or not, next time we will return to the actual murder mystery, because we're about to discover Berengar's corpse. Watch. Okay. Now it's a little funny to say watch for the things that aren't said. So I won't say anything as silly as that. Let me instead say that the things that I am really interested to talk about, especially in the next couple segments, the scene in the baths, and then the analysis of the corpse, and the staining on the fingers and tongue of Berengar. I'm very interested to see how these fit into patterns of interpretation. I think they're very interestingly and cunningly chosen examples. So we'll talk some more about that. And who knows, maybe go even a little further beyond that. So let's see. How far do we want to go into day 4? Definitely the conversation with Severinus at the beginning. I think, yeah, let's definitely read through Tierce. Let's get feisty here. Let's read through Tierce. So stop at Sect. Well, at least I should say instead, I have no aspiration to get all the way up through into Sect. But we'll see if we can get through Tierce next time. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for your patience. And I will see you guys next time. Bye now.